It started before the sun ever rose. A soft clang echoed through the chill of the early morning, barely heard beyond the stone cottages and thatched roofs of the village. The blacksmith was already awake. He had to be. The forge, nestled near the edge of the village like a stubborn old tree, had no patience for sleep. Neither did the people who depended on it. Horses needed shoes, plows needed fixing, weapons needed sharpening. And all of it always was needed now. Thick, calloused hands gripped iron tongs as the blacksmith, his name was Wulfric, placed a glowing rod of metal back onto the anvil. Sweat had already soaked through the wool of his tunic, even though the air outside still bit with frost. His face was marked by years of heat, smoke, and unspoken burdens. Every wrinkle had a reason. Every scar had a memory. And every breath carried the quiet weight of a life most people overlooked. Wulfric wasn't born into the trade. No one in his family had ever swung a hammer. His father was a woodcutter, and his mother baked bread for the Lord's manor. But after a winter plague took both of them in the same week, Wulfric found himself alone at just 10 years old. He wandered into the forge one day, half-starved and too tired to beg. The blacksmith at the time, a giant named Osric, looked at him once, then handed him a broom. From that moment on, iron would be his world. Life in a medieval village was no fairy tale. It was cold, rough, and full of silence. Days were built around toil, and nights offered little rest. But for Wulfric, the forge became more than just a place of work. It was a shelter from the cruel world outside. The fire inside was the only warmth he knew, and the rhythm of hammering iron was the only music that played in his life. The villagers respected him in the way one respects a stone bridge, silent, sturdy, necessary. He wasn't a knight, nor a noble, but when a knight's sword broke or a noble's gate latch snapped, they came to him. They didn't know what it took to make those things. They didn't see the burns, the crushed fingernails, or the backaches that never went away. They just needed the work done, and Wulfric did it without question. He didn't smile much. He didn't speak much either. Not because he was unkind, but because words like iron were only worth something when they had weight. He shared meals alone, worked alone, and slept in a room behind the forge that smelled of smoke, oil, and damp earth. The forge was never really cold, even in winter, but sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, it felt lonelier than a monastery bell tower. Still, there was something noble about his labor. Every nail he forged helped raise a roof. Every horseshoe he crafted kept carts moving. Every sword he made, though he hated making them, meant someone might live another day. He never told anyone, but he always made the edges of the blades just a little less sharp for the young men who seemed too eager to fight. Maybe that was his small rebellion. One day, just as summer faded into the amber breath of autumn, a stranger arrived in the village. His clothes were travel-worn, but clean. His hands were soft. A scholar, maybe, or a merchant. He asked questions, too many, really. Wanted to know about the forge, the metal, the tools. Wanted to see Wulfric work. The blacksmith wasn't used to attention, and certainly not from someone who seemed so out of place. "Do you know the name Alaric?" the man asked one evening, standing just inside the flickering light of the forge. Wulfric paused. The name stirred something buried. He hadn't heard it spoken in years. Alaric had been Osric's son, a boy with fire in his heart and war on his mind. He'd left the village long ago, chasing glory on battlefields far from home. That name, like so many things from Wulfric's youth, had faded into smoke. The stranger smiled, but not with warmth. It was the kind of smile people wore when they already knew the answer. They say he's returned. Not alone, either, and not with peace. That night, Wulfric didn't sleep. He sat in the forge long after the fire burned low. The tools around him, hammers, tongs, chisels, suddenly looked like weapons. His mind wandered back to the last time he saw Alaric. The boy had been furious, full of pride and hate. He'd sworn he'd never come back unless it was to tear the place down. The next morning, smoke rose from the chimney, as usual. Villagers passed by, nodding, dropping off orders. But Wulfric's eyes weren't on the iron anymore. They were watching the horizon, watching the road, waiting. The stranger was gone. No one had seen where he went. but his words stayed behind, like ash clinging to the corners of the forge. For the first time in years, Wulfric sharpened a blade for himself. Not for sale, not for show, just in case. There was a tension in the village now, unspoken, uneasy. Animals were restless. The wind carried odd scents. And far off, in the woods beyond the fields, lights were seen at night. Not torches, not stars, just flickering lights no one could explain. The children whispered about ghosts. The elders said it was just their eyes playing tricks. But Wulfric knew better. The world had a way of warning those who listened. And he had spent a lifetime listening. He couldn't say why, but something was coming. Something from his past. Something tied to the metal in his hands, the hammer he swung, and the fire he kept alive. Maybe Alaric. Maybe something worse. For now, the forge still stood, humming with heat and echoing with rhythm. Wulfric worked as he always did, alone, silent, steady. But this time, every strike of his hammer felt like a countdown. And deep down, behind the soot and scars, the blacksmith who had built tools for others his whole life was preparing, at last, to face a battle of his own. And then, just before nightfall, someone knocked on his door. The knock wasn't loud. It was slow, deliberate, 3 firm taps spaced evenly apart. Wulfric's hand froze mid-motion, the red-hot horseshoe clamped in his tongs, starting to cool. He hadn't had a visitor at his door in years, not one who came after dusk. Most people in the village knew better than to bother a blacksmith after he doused the coals. But this knock wasn't from someone who cared about custom. He set the iron back into the forge, removed his gloves, and wiped his hands on his apron. For a brief moment, he stood still, just listening. No voices outside. No footsteps, just the soft creak of wood in the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. Wulfric opened the door. A boy, no older than 16, stood there, hood pulled low, cloak heavy with dust. He wasn't from a village. Wulfric knew every face in a 5-mile stretch, and this one was new. The boy looked nervous, fidgeting with something inside his cloak. "Are you Wulfric, the blacksmith?" the boy asked, eyes darting past him to the glowing forge behind. Wulfric gave a silent nod. The boy reached into his cloak and pulled out a wrapped bundle. It was long, narrow, and heavy. He unrolled the cloth slowly, revealing a sword unlike anything Wulfric had seen in years. The blade was scarred, chipped in places, but still shimmered with a dark steel sheen. It wasn't a common weapon. This had been forged with purpose, and not by any local hand. "Where did you get this?" Wulfric asked, voice low and steady. The boy hesitated. "It belonged to my brother. He's dead now, but he told me to bring it here. Said if anything happened to him, I should find the blacksmith in the village with the stone chimney." Wulfric picked up the blade carefully. It was heavier than it looked, not in weight, but in presence. He turned it in the light, eyes narrowing at a faint marking near the hilt. An old sigil, one he hadn't seen in decades. It was the symbol Alaric used to carve into his practice swords when they were boys. He looked at the boy again. "What was your brother's name?" The boy hesitated again, then said softly, "Jareth." He was a scout for a group called the Hollow Men. Wulfric's stomach turned. That name was no rumor. The Hollow Men had become the stuff of whispers in border villages, mercenaries, raiders, soldiers who fought for coin and burned what they couldn't take. They left no banners, only ashes. "Did your brother say what they were planning?" Wulfric asked. He didn't have time, only that something was coming, that someone from this village would understand what to do. The boy looked tired, eyes shadowed by fear. Wulfric could see the same expression he used to wear in the mirror as a child. Lost, worn down, clinging to the last thread of trust. He didn't ask the boy to stay, but he didn't turn him away either. He pointed to the bench inside the forge. "You hungry?" The boy nodded quickly. Wulfric gave him bread and a small chunk of cured meat, then sat across from him, laying the sword flat on the table. The more he studied it, the more sure he became. This blade was Alaric's design. Same grip, same balance, same stubborn defiance in its shape. But the craftsmanship was different. Someone else had forged it. Someone who'd learned from Alaric, or worse, someone he'd taught. That night, Wulfric didn't sleep. He kept the forge burning well past midnight, reheating the sword, testing its metal, searching for any clue. Every mark on the blade told a story. Battles fought, lives lost, roads traveled. But one detail chilled him, the faint burn near the base of the handle. It was the mark of a black sun, surrounded by jagged rays. He'd only seen it once, etched into the hilt of a ceremonial blade Alaric had forged during his final days in the village. Back then, it was just a symbol of ego. Now, it had become something darker. The boy, who introduced himself as Tomas, slept beside the forge, wrapped in a blanket that barely kept out the cold. Wulfric watched him for a while, remembering a younger version of himself lying by the same fire, waiting for the world to make sense. That night, as the coals hissed and cracked, the past clawed its way back into the blacksmith's life, and the weight of it settled heavily on his shoulders. In the morning, the village buzzed with an unusual hush. People moved quickly, but spoke little. Rumors had spread fast. Someone had seen riders in the woods. Not local men. Too fast. Too organized. No one knew what they wanted, but everyone sensed trouble. Wulfric and Tomas walked to the edge of the village. The boy carried the sword on his back, wrapped once more in cloth. They passed familiar faces. Marta the baker, old Anselm the carpenter, young Ida who herded the goats. Wulfric gave each a quiet nod. Most returned the gesture, some with confusion, others with fear. They could all feel it now. Change had arrived. At the edge of the forest, Wulfric stopped. "What do we do now?" Tomas asked. The blacksmith looked into the trees. The path ahead was narrow, overgrown. It led toward the hills, toward places he'd sworn never to return. He hadn't walked that road since the day Alaric left, shouting curses over his shoulder, a blade half forged at his side. Wulfric turned to the boy. "We find out what he's become, and why he sent you here. But what if it's not him?" Tomas asked. Wulfric's eyes darkened. "Then we'll find out who's using his name. Either way, I have a feeling this forge is going to be busy soon." They didn't speak much after that. Wulfric went back to work, reforging old tools, sharpening axes, reinforcing hinges and buckles. Not for orders, but for readiness. The villagers watched with quiet curiosity, not asking questions they didn't want answers to. By sunset, Tomas had helped where he could, sweeping, sorting, carrying water. He wasn't strong, not yet, but Wulfric saw the same stubborn fire Alaric once carried. Maybe it was in the blood. Then, as night drew near and the wind shifted, the warning came. A rider galloped into the village square, barely able to stay on his horse. His face was bloodied, cloak torn. "They're coming," he gasped. 10:20. Armed. Black cloaks. No banners. The village froze. And Wulfric, covered in soot and silence, walked into the square holding a blade freshly honed. He didn't say a word, but his presence alone told them what they needed to know. The blacksmith was no longer just a man of iron fire. He was a man of memory, of purpose, and someone had finally given him a reason to fight again. But as the villagers began to prepare, barricading homes, hiding children, lighting signal fires, none of them knew the real truth. This wasn't just a raid. This wasn't just a passing band of thugs. This was the beginning of something far older. Something buried in Wulfric's past, and soon to be unearthed in the heart of the village. Because deep in the woods, far from the warmth of the forge, someone else stood watching. A figure in a black cloak, scarred hands, and in his belt, a blade that looked almost identical to the one Tomas had brought. Only sharper, hungrier, and etched with the same black sun. The figure in the woods didn't move. He stood just beyond the tree lean, silent as a shadow, watching the smoke curl from the village chimneys. His face was weathered, and though the years had carved deep lines into his brow, his eyes were sharp, too sharp for a man who had once called this place home. He studied the layout of the houses, the location of the forge, the worn footpaths between the fields. Everything was exactly where he had left it, and yet nothing felt the same. The wind stirred his cloak, revealing a set of throwing knives strapped across his chest, each one engraved with that black sun, his new mark. Once, long ago, he'd worn the sigil with pride. Now was a warning, a signal to all who crossed his path. Alaric had returned, and he was no longer bound by the rules of this village or the mercy of his childhood. He turned and motioned with 2 fingers. Behind him, more figures emerged from the woods, dressed in dark leathers and patchwork armor. They moved like wolves, quiet, coordinated, patient. These were not common raiders. These were trained men, hollow men. Alaric didn't speak as they approached. He didn't need to. His presence alone commanded obedience. He pointed toward the hill overlooking the village. The men nodded and began to move into position. Back in the village, Wulfric stood at the forge, hammering away at something he hadn't crafted in years, a shield. Simple, round, wooden core, but reinforced with iron bands and a solid boss in the center. He didn't know if he'd use it himself or hand it to someone else, but it felt necessary. Everything he did now felt that way. Each movement was deliberate, each strike of the hammer carrying a weight far beyond metal. Tomas sat nearby, watching him work. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions. He simply observed, eyes wide, soaking in every motion. For all his fear and confusion, the boy was learning. Wulfric could see it in the way Tomas had started to hold things differently, tools, firewood, even the way he carried the sword. Like someone realizing the world was much heavier than it had seemed just days ago. I never knew blacksmithing could be so. Tomas began, searching for the word. Urgent, Wulfric offered, glancing up from the shield. The boy nodded. It wasn't supposed to be, Wulfric muttered, turning back to the anvil. It was supposed to be quiet, predictable, honest. He didn't say it out loud, but the truth hung between them. That time was over. That night, the village council gathered in the small stone hall near the center of town. Wulfric had avoided those meetings for years, but this time he stood at the front. The room was lit by only a few torches, their flames casting tall, twitching shadows on the walls. Farmers, herders, tradespeople, all seated on rough benches, waiting for someone to say what they were all thinking. They're not just passing through, Wulfric said, his voice low and certain. They're looking for something, or someone. We don't even know who they are, someone replied. We haven't seen a flag. We haven't been threatened. They haven't needed to speak yet, Wulfric said. But they will. He laid the sword Tomas had brought down on the table. Gasps went up around the room. Everyone knew what it was, even if they'd never seen it before. That shape, that dark metal, that feeling of menace, it wasn't a tool. It was a message. They call themselves the Hollow Men, Tomas added from the doorway. My brother joined them. He said they're not after land. They're after control. Symbols. Power. A silence fell over the room. And this black sun, Wulfric continued, tracing the mark on the blade with a thick finger. It's not just a symbol. It's a promise. That no one will be spared. He didn't say Alaric's name. Not yet. Some wounds took longer to reopen. We can send word to the Lord, one of the elders offered. Maybe he'll send men. Maybe, Wulfric said. But by then it could be too late. The council ended without a decision. People drifted back to their homes, uncertain and afraid. Some began packing belongings. Others sharpened kitchen knives. A few prayed. But the quiet desperation in their movements told Wulfric everything he needed to know. They were not ready. He walked back to the forge under a moonless sky. The stars were hidden behind drifting clouds, and the village felt more like a whisper than a place. Tomas trailed behind him, holding the sword awkwardly in both hands. I want to learn, the boy said suddenly. How to fight. How to use this. Wulfric looked at him for a long moment. That's not what blacksmiths do. I know, Tomas said, but maybe it should be. Wulfric sighed and took the sword from him. You hold it like you're afraid of it. I am, Tomas admitted. Good, Wulfric said. Fear means you haven't lost your mind. He placed the blade on the rack and motioned to the corner. Start with the bellows. We've got more iron to shape. Over the next few days, Wulfric worked like a man possessed. He reforged broken tools into crude weapons. He melted down scrap into arrowheads. He repaired hinges, bolted shutters, and even reinforced the village gate with iron bands, though it hadn't been shut in over a decade. The forge didn't rest, and neither did he. Word of the Hollow Men spread quickly. A neighboring village had been raided. No survivors. Fields burned. Livestock slaughtered. Still no flag, no declaration, just silence and destruction. The pattern was clear now. They were circling, tightening, and still, no one knew why this village mattered. Then, on the sixth night after Tomas arrived, someone knocked again. But this time, they didn't wait for Wulfric to answer. The door creaked open, and a voice rang out. Familiar. Cold. It's been a long time, brother. Wulfric turned slowly, the hammer still in his hand. There, standing in the glow of the forge, was Alaric. Older, leaner, his hair streaked with gray, but unmistakable. The firelight danced across his face, casting flickering shadows on the scars that now marked his cheek. His eyes were sharp, sharper than Wulfric remembered, and they were filled with something that chilled the air around them. Not hatred, not sadness, conviction. I told you I'd return, Alaric said softly, stepping forward. Wulfric didn't move. You brought war with you. Alaric smiled faintly. I brought a choice. Behind him, 3 hollow men stepped into view, silent as ghosts. And somewhere, far off in the darkened hills, horns began to blow. The horns echoed like cries from another world, low, distant, and full of warning. They rolled down the hills like thunder, reaching the ears of every sleeping soul in the village. Dogs began to bark. Doors creaked open. Fires were relit with shaking hands. People stirred in their beds, unsure if it was a nightmare or something far worse. Inside the forge, Wulfric stared across the dim glow at his brother. Alaric hadn't aged kindly. His face was more bone than flesh, his eyes colder than the steel he once admired. But Wulfric saw something else beneath that hard surface, a man shaped by war, not by time. A man who had made choices and had learned to live with them. The scars on his skin were nothing compared to the ones on his spirit. You shouldn't have come back, Wulfric said quietly, lowering his hammer to the workbench. You always said I'd ruin things if I stayed, Alaric replied, taking another step closer. So I left. I ruined things somewhere else. The tension between them stretched tight as wire. The years of silence, the broken bond, the memories of childhood spent sparring behind the forge. They were all here now, packed into this one quiet moment before whatever was coming. What do you want? Wulfric asked. Alaric looked around the forge, his gaze lingering on the tools, the steel, the glowing embers. You never left. You stayed here, swinging your hammer while the world changed around you. You still think a piece of iron can hold back what's out there? It's held enough, Wulfric replied, meeting his gaze. Alaric's smile faded. I didn't come for a fight, Wolf. Not yet. I came to offer you something. One last time. He pulled a rolled parchment from beneath his cloak and set on the bench. It was sealed with black wax. The symbol of the hollow men stamped clearly into the center. Wulfric didn't touch it. This village doesn't matter, Alaric said, almost softly. It's nothing. A few crumbling homes, a forge, some scared farmers. But you still matter. You know how to make things that last. You understand power in a way most fools never will. I understand pain, Wulfric said, and loss. Alaric didn't argue. He just nodded, as if he too remembered the winter their parents died, the years scraping by in silence, the fights they had in the mud behind the forge. I'm giving you a chance, Alaric continued. Join us. Teach us. Help forge something greater. We're not just raiders, Wolf. We're building an order. A new way. Wulfric's jaw tightened. At the edge of his sword? Alaric's voice was quiet now. At the edge of survival. The two brothers stood in that moment like statues carved by time. The fire crackled between them, the only sound in the heavy stillness. From the side of the forge, Tomas finally moved. He had stayed frozen in the shadows since Alaric entered, but now he stepped forward, blade in hand. Alaric turned his head slightly, amused. You trained the boy already? He's learning, Wulfric said. Tomas raised a sword, hands shaking but firm. You're the one who sent my brother to die. Alaric looked at him. Your brother made a choice. Like I did. Like Wulfric will. I already have, Wulfric said flatly. Alaric studied his brother for a long moment, then gave a single nod, as if he'd expected it all along. You're still a fool, he said, but a loyal one. He turned, cloak rustling against the stone floor. His men followed without a word, melting back into the night. The horns had stopped. The silence they left behind was worse. Wulfric exhaled slowly, only now realizing how tightly he'd been holding his breath. Tomas lowered the sword. He was telling the truth, wasn't he? Wulfric didn't answer right away. He walked to the door, looked out into the village square. Lamps were flickering in windows. People were awake now, scared and unsure. He could feel the eyes on him. Waiting. He believes it, Wulfric said, and that's enough to make it real. They didn't sleep that night. Wulfric worked through the darkness, reforging weapons, sharpening spears, instructing Tomas on how to strike, block, and breathe. By morning, villagers began to gather. One by one, they brought what little they had, kitchen knives, hunting bows, broken tools. And they stood in the forge, waiting their turn. It wasn't an army. It wasn't even a militia. It was a handful of farmers, mothers, old men, and teenage boys. But it was something. And Wulfric, the man they had once thought silent and strange, stood at the center of it all. By midday, scouts returned. The hollow men had encircled the hills. No way out, no way in. It was only a matter of time. That evening, Wulfric gathered the villagers in the small square. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of burning pitch. He looked around at the faces he had known all his life, and at Tomas, the stranger who had somehow become part of this strange chapter. "They're coming," he said, "and they don't care who we are. To them, we're just another fire to put out. But we know something they don't. We've built things. We've lasted. We've survived winters they've never seen." He held up a blacksmith's hammer. "This is how we do it. One strike at a time. One wall at a time. If they want to take this village, they'll have to tear it from our hands." The villagers didn't cheer. They weren't warriors, but they stood a little taller. And just as the last light of day began to fade, a single arrow landed in the center of the square. Black shaft, red fletching. A message. Tomas picked it up, reading the scrap of parchment tied to the shaft. "They march at dawn." Wulfric didn't blink. He simply turned back to the forge. "Then we burn all night." And in the dark hills beyond, watching the smoke rise into the stars, Alaric stood once more at the head of his men, his sword drawn, his face calm, because in his mind, the village was already gone. He just hadn't told his brother that yet. The forge roared through the night, flames licking up like they were trying to claw their way into the stars. Sparks flew every time Wulfric's hammer met steel. The sound echoed through the village like a drumbeat, steady and strong, a reminder that they were still here, still fighting, even if the fight hadn't started yet. Tomas worked beside him, red-faced and sweating, hands blistered from the bellows. He didn't complain. He didn't ask when they'd stop. In some quiet, unspoken way, he had become part of this place now, and it was changing him. Outside, the village had transformed. Barricades made of broken carts and hay bales had been dragged into the main paths. Buckets of sand and water sat beside every home, ready to douse fire. Archers, if they could be called that, had taken up positions on rooftops and haylofts, most of them more used to hunting rabbits than defending lives. Wulfric watched them whenever he stepped outside for air. He saw the fear on their faces, but also the determination. They weren't ready. Not really, but they were willing. People had started calling him Master Wulfric. He didn't correct them, not because he liked it, but because it seemed to give them something to hold on to. If the blacksmith wasn't scared, maybe they didn't have to be either. By candlelight, the elders of the village sat in quiet meetings, whispering about what to do if the worst came. Some wanted to surrender. Others said they should try to flee, but no one knew a way out that wouldn't run straight into the hollow men. And then there were those who simply waited, clinging to the rhythm of routine, chopping wood, baking bread, tending animals, pretending, if only for a few hours, that dawn wouldn't bring death. But deep down they all knew. Wulfric knew too. He hadn't forgotten the kind of man his brother used to be, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Alaric hadn't just come back for conquest. There was something else, something unfinished between them. He could feel it in the way Alaric looked at him, like they were still boys behind the forge, fighting over who would swing the hammer next. But this wasn't childhood anymore, and the stakes weren't bruises or scoldings from Osric. This time it was everything. Tomas sat near the fire, staring into the coals. His face was smudged with ash, and his fingers trembled as he ran a cloth over the blade he'd carried for days. "My brother always said I should learn a trade," he said quietly. Wulfric looked up from his work. "What did you want to do?" "I never had a choice," Tomas said. "When my father died, Jareth took over. He joined the Hollow Men because he thought it would feed us. Thought it would keep us safe." "Did it?" Tomas shook his head. "No, it just made him different. He stopped laughing, stopped sleeping. Then one day, he came home with blood on his boots and wouldn't say whose it was." Wulfric said nothing. He knew that look, the one Tomas had seen in his brother. He'd seen it in Alaric too. He saw it again now, staring back at him from the surface of the glowing iron. The look of a man who had given up parts of himself just to stay alive. Tomas broke the silence. "You and your brother, what happened?" Wulfric thought for a long moment before answering. "We were both apprenticed to the old smith. Osric. He taught us everything. How to hold a hammer, how to temper a blade. Alaric picked it up faster than I did. He was better even, but he hated the waiting, the patience. He wanted to build swords before he knew how to make nails. He wanted to fight. No, Wulfric said. He wanted to be feared. There's a difference." He looked out toward the dark hills. The wind had picked up, blowing ash and soot in small swirls across the ground. He left after a fight, not just a shouting match, a real one. In the forge, late at night. He said I was holding him back, that the village was too small, too weak. He wanted to join the Lord's Guard. Said he'd become something more. I told him a fire would consume him if he kept feeding it the wrong way. "And now he's back," Tomas said. Wulfric nodded. "And he's brought the fire with him." They didn't speak for a while. Just worked. Just waited. As the night dragged on, others came to the forge. A man with a dented breastplate asked Wulfric to mend it. A mother brought her son's wooden sword, asking if it could be reinforced with iron. Even Marta the baker appeared with a carving knife, embarrassed but firm. "I won't let them take my home without a fight," she said. Wulfric didn't turn anyone away. Somewhere around midnight, a scout returned. The Hollow Men had lit torches on the ridge. Dozens of them. They weren't hiding anymore. They wanted the village to see, to know. "They're building something," the scout said. "A platform. Maybe a signal fire." Wulfric's brow furrowed. Alaric never did anything without purpose. If they were building a fire, it wasn't for warmth. "Keep watching," he said, "and stay out of sight." By the early hours before dawn, a strange silence settled over the village. The kind that comes before a storm. The animals were restless. The air felt thick. Even the forge, once alive with noise, seemed quieter, like it too was bracing for what was coming. Wulfric stood at the doorway, hammer in hand, as the sky began to pale. He looked across the rooftops and fields, past the fences and watch posts, up toward the hills where flickers of torchlight still danced. And then he saw it, a shape, tall, wide, silhouetted against the fire. It was a cart, hauled into place by the Hollow Men, draped in cloth and marked with paint. A siege ram? A pyre? No, it was a cage. Something moved inside it. Someone. Wulfric's blood ran cold. They weren't just here to conquer. They had a message. And whoever, or whatever, was inside that cage might be the key to it all. The forge had grown quiet, except for the low crackle of dying embers. Oswin sat on the rough wooden bench beside his anvil, hands heavy on his lap, skin slick with sweat and ash. His face was half lit by the fire, the rest swallowed in the kind of shadow that seemed to breathe. Outside, the village had gone still, save for a few distant sounds. Dogs barking, a creaky wagon wheel, wind dragging itself across the rooftops. But inside the forge, it felt like time had slowed. Not stopped, not entirely, but slowed in that strange way it does when something's about to change. The day's work had been brutal. A cracked horseshoe for the Reeves gelding, a shattered chisel for the carpenter, and then 2 hours reshaping a broken door latch that could have been replaced in half the time, if the man had the coin. Oswin didn't ask questions. He just worked. That's what blacksmiths did. They shaped what was broken, mended what others tossed aside. But tonight, as he sat staring at the quiet forge, Oswin felt something cracked inside himself, something no hammer could fix. The boy, Edrin, had finally stopped coughing. He lay curled in a blanket behind the forge wall, the way Oswin had left him, half hidden from the wind and from prying eyes. Not that many bothered coming around after sunset. Still, Oswin kept him close. The boy had turned up a week ago, shivering, bruised, clothes torn like he'd been dragged through the woods. He hadn't said where he came from, just kept repeating the same thing in a soft, raspy voice. Asterisk, they were looking for me. Asterisk, Oswin hadn't pressed him. He knew what it meant to be hunted. Not by men, necessarily, but by poverty, by cruelty, by misfortune. All things that walked the land like shadows and didn't need names. In the morning, the village would want answers. The reeve was already circling, curious why Oswin had been seen at the edge of the woods 3 nights in a row. There were rumors, strange sounds at night, flickers of light far beyond the thatched roofs and grazing fields. The baker's youngest claimed she saw a figure limping toward the chapel, then vanishing behind the stone crypt. Most villagers rolled their eyes and blamed the ale, but Oswin knew better. The land didn't lie. It whispered, but it never lied. Edrin stirred, letting out a soft moan as he shifted beneath the blanket. Oswin stood and crossed the forge floor, the wooden planks creaking under his boots. He knelt beside the boy and placed a hand gently on his forehead. Still warm, but not burning. That was something, at least. The welts on his arms had started to fade, though his eyes still darted like a wild animal's every time the wind blew too hard. "You're safe here," Oswin whispered, not expecting a response. "I heard them again," Edrin murmured, barely audible. They're getting closer." Oswin didn't ask who. He just reached for the ladle by the water basin and held it to the boy's lips. He drank slowly, shakily, like every swallow was a fight. When he finished, Oswin stood again, glanced at the shuttered window, and stepped outside. The village of Eldwick wasn't much. 12 homes, 1 chapel, 2 inns, and a dozen more barns than anyone cared to count. But what it lacked in size, it made up for in silence. People here didn't speak unless they had to. Secrets sat heavier than snow on these roofs. And even though the blacksmith was respected, needed, he wasn't trusted. Not really. He worked too late, spoke too little, and kept to the edges of festivals like a man who knew too much or too little. No one was quite sure. Tonight, the moon hung low and thick like it had grown tired of floating. A fine mist rolled through the trees to the east, where the woods began. Oswin scanned the horizon, but saw no movement. Still, his gut twisted. Something wasn't right. He stepped back inside and bolted the door. Edrin had already slipped back into a light sleep, though his body twitched now and then, like he was still running from something in his dreams. Oswin pulled the blanket tighter around him, then returned to the forge, tossing a few chunks of oak into the fire. The flames roared to life, filling the room with heat and shadows that danced along the stone walls. He needed answers, and the boy wasn't ready to give them. Oswin reached for the pouch of dried herbs he kept in the back, a blend passed down from his grandmother, who had been called a healer in one generation and a witch in another. He sprinkled a few pinches into a cup of hot water and let it steep, something to steady the nerves, to keep the mind from wandering too far into the dark. Then from outside a sound. Not footsteps. Not quite. More like dragging. Something, or someone, moving slowly along the edge of the forge wall. Oswin didn't move. He reached for the poker resting by the hearth, gripped it tightly, and edged toward the door. The boy was still asleep, unaware. That was good. Oswin pressed his ear to the wood. The sound stopped. Silence again. Then 3 sharp taps. Not random. Deliberate. He unlatched the door and cracked it open, revealing nothing but mist and the vague outline of the trees. "Who's there?" Oswin called, voice low but firm. No answer. He stepped out slowly, poker in hand, scanning the darkness. "Whoever you are, you're trespassing on village land," he warned. Still no reply. Just the wind. But then a flicker, a glow, faint and pale, deeper in the woods. Not firelight, too cold. Almost like moonlight caught in a jar. It pulsed once, then vanished. Oswin cursed under his breath and backed into the forge, bolting the door again. The woods were no place for wandering tonight. Not with that glow. Not with the boy's warning still ringing in his head. They're getting closer. Who were they? Oswin returned to the bench, but didn't sit. He watched the fire, listened to the hiss of wood and the distant howl of wind. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones. And when it came, he knew no hammer or steel would be enough to stop it. Each morning, as the gray mist lifted off the thatched rooftops and the village stirred from slumber, Ulrich's forge was already alive. The air outside remained cool, but inside his small stone workshop, it was always stifling. The crackling fire hissed with intensity, and the scent of burnt iron, soot, and sweat wrapped around the place like an invisible cloak. Most villagers passed quickly by his shop, eyes low, respectful but distant. Some feared his work, others admired it, but few truly understood the weight Ulrich carried with every hammer blow. He wasn't just shaping tools or horseshoes. Every piece of metal he worked with told a story. A blade for a young knight leaving for a distant war. A hinge for a church door struck by lightning. Nails to rebuild a cottage after a fire no one talked about openly. He was building the very bones of their world, with fire, steel, and unspoken pain. Ulrich didn't speak much. He'd learned over the years that words were sometimes as heavy as anvils. But there were days when his silence wasn't just about focus. It was about the memory of a scream, one that had never left his ears, one that had echoed in his dreams since the siege, the fire, and the loss of someone he couldn't save. His apprentice, Leofric, had begun to notice the signs. Not just the restless nights or the way Ulrich's hands trembled when he thought no one was looking, but the old chest in the corner of the forge never opened. It was made of oak, bound with rusted iron. Leofric had asked about it once. Ulrich hadn't raised his voice, but his gaze had been enough. The boy hadn't asked again. Now, as the summer deepened and the days grew longer, tensions in the village also began to rise. Rumors came down the road like dry leaves before a storm. Whispers of increased taxes, roving bandits, and noble feuds spilling into nearby towns. The blacksmith's forge, once a quiet rhythm of village life, was slowly becoming a hub of whispered requests and nervous glances. "Can you make a spearhead, just in case?" a farmer had asked one evening, looking over his shoulder. Not for war, just for protection. Another came the next week. "Could you sharpen this old sword? My grandfather's. Haven't used it in years." Ulrich never said no, but with each new weapon he made, something inside him coiled tighter. He knew too well what these tools were capable of. He'd seen men broken by blades they could barely lift. He'd watched flames eat through villages faster than prayers could rise. But even more unsettling than the rising conflict were the odd visits. Cloaked figures arriving late in the evening, speaking in low tones, offering more silver than any commoner could spare. They didn't say where they came from or what the weapons were for, only that they needed them strong, quick, and quiet. Leofric didn't like the look of them. Once, he caught sight of a tattoo on one of their wrists, a mark he'd seen in his uncle's old war tales. It wasn't the emblem of any lord. It was older, stranger. That night, he lay awake in his loft above the forge, listening to the wind press against the wooden shutters, wondering what kind of business they were becoming entangled in. Ulrich never explained, but he became harsher in his training, pushing Leofric harder, demanding focus, discipline, and silence. The boy grew stronger, yes, but also more wary. The warmth that had once existed between them had cooled. There were still moments of quiet understanding, a hand on the shoulder, a shared mug of warm ale after a long day. But something weighed heavy on Ulrich's spirit, and Leofric feared it might crush them both. One afternoon, while sorting scrap metal behind the forge, Leofric noticed a traveler approaching. Not cloaked, not nervous. This one was different, tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. He wore no armor, only a faded tunic, but he moved like someone who'd worn chainmail for years. His eyes scanned the village like he was searching for ghosts. He entered the forge without a word. Ulrich looked up, and for the first time in days, Leofric saw the blacksmith's face change. Not surprise, not fear, recognition. The stranger placed a broken sword on the anvil. The blade was chipped, the handle cracked, but the shape was unmistakable. Ulrich ran his fingers along the edge, then met the man's gaze. "You kept it," Ulrich said, voice low. "It's not mine to throw away," the man replied. Silence followed. The fire crackled. Leofric, frozen in the doorway, dared not move. "What do you need?" Ulrich finally asked. "A reminder. Of what we lost. Of what's coming." Ulrich nodded once, then picked up the blade. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The past had walked through his door, and it had brought with it the shadows of something darker. As the hammer began to ring once more, Leofric returned to his work, but his thoughts raced. Who was that man? What had they lost? And what exactly was coming? That evening, after the stranger left and the forge cooled down, Ulrich sat on the bench outside. The sun dipped behind the hills, casting a soft amber glow over the village. Leofric approached quietly, sitting beside him. "Was he a friend?" the boy asked. Ulrich didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Once, before everything burned." They sat in silence. Crickets chirped in the tall grass. The village dogs barked in the distance. "Why are they all coming to you?" Leofric asked. "The cloaked men, the stranger, the villagers. Why do they all think you can protect them?" Ulrich turned his tired eyes to the boy. "Because they think the man who helped build war can help stop one." "But can you?" Leofric whispered. Ulrich didn't answer. Later that night, as the village lights flickered out and the forge lay quiet, Leofric crept downstairs. He stood before the old oak chest, heart pounding. The moonlight spilled through a crack in the shutters, silvering the floor. With trembling fingers, he reached toward the latch and paused. Behind him, in the darkness, a voice said softly, "Not yet." "Ulrich." The boy turned, startled, but his master wasn't angry. Just tired. Haunted. "When it's time," Ulrich said, "you'll know what's inside." Leofric nodded slowly, stepping back. The chest remained closed. But the questions did not. Outside, far beyond the village, fires were already beginning to light on distant hills. Signals, warnings, or something worse. And in the forge, beneath layers of soot and ash, the past was slowly waking, with every swing of the hammer. By the time the first snow started to drift into the village, Elias was barely sleeping. The forge had turned colder, more brutal, yet the work only increased. Orders came from neighboring towns, from wealthier lords stocking weapons for reasons no one dared to question out loud. Elias hammered by day and shaped steel by night, his arms aching, his fingers blistered. Yet something deeper gnawed at him, something he couldn't strike away with a hammer or melt in the fire. He started noticing odd faces in the village. Riders who never dismounted. Merchants with empty carts. Foreign accents asking too many questions. It all felt wrong. He confided in Wulfric one evening, while they were tightening the last rivets into a gate hinge ordered by the local reeve. "You ever feel like something's watching this village? Like we're on the edge of something we don't see yet?" Wulfric didn't answer right away. He wiped sweat from his brow and looked around. "It's not just you," he finally said. "I've seen it too. Strangers asking about routes in and out, supplies. We're not soldiers, Elias, but I think we're about to be caught in something we didn't start." They both looked out the forge window. The sky was unusually red. While Elias worried about unseen dangers, his apprentice, Tobin, had his own troubles. Tobin had grown fond of Freya, the baker's daughter. Their stolen moments by the mill stream were quiet and sweet, but her father had taken notice. And he didn't want his only daughter mixing with a boy whose hands were burned and blackened and who smelled of iron and soot. Love, in the medieval world, didn't blossom easily, especially not for a blacksmith's apprentice with no coin and little land. Tobin started sneaking out at night, first just to see her, then to explore the woods beyond the village. Freya had told him once that she saw a fire deep in the trees, far from any known path. One night, curiosity overcame sense. He left Elias sleeping by the embers and followed the stream out past the boundary stone. What he found shook him to his bones. In a clearing lit by the pale light of a single torch, there was a circle of figures. They wore cloaks of faded blue, each holding iron rods shaped like brands. On a stone slab in the center was a burned animal carcass, something large, like a deer. Tobin hid behind a log, heart pounding. He saw one of the figures place a scroll on the stone, chanting something in a tongue he couldn't understand. Another pulled out a blade, thin, curved, and etched with runes. Whatever this was, it wasn't part of any prayer his mother had taught him. Tobin didn't see the figure behind him until it was too late. He woke up the next morning in his straw bed at the forge, head pounding, with Elias staring down at him. "Where were you, Tobin?" Elias asked quietly, the usual sharpness in his tone gone. "You came back near dawn with a bruise the size of an egg and mud all over your boots." Tobin couldn't lie. He tried, but the images haunted him. He told Elias everything about Freya, the fire, the cloaked figures, the strange language. Elias listened in silence, then stood up. "We don't speak of this again. Not to Wulfric, not to anyone. Understand? But what were they doing?" "I don't know," Elias said. "And we're better off not knowing until we're forced to." Yet not knowing didn't mean forgetting. That day, Elias took an unused chunk of steel and began crafting something different. Not a horseshoe, not a scythe. A blade, one unlike any other he had ever made. It wasn't for war. It wasn't for show. It was for protection. For something he couldn't yet name, but felt growing around them like smoke before a fire. Meanwhile, the village began to change. The reeve called for weapons. The carpenter boarded up his windows. The innkeepers started storing dried meats in barrels sealed with wax. Nobody said the word, but everyone felt it. War. Or worse. And as tensions rose, so did tempers. Freya's father found out about Tobin and forbade her from ever speaking to him again. She wept in the bakery, the smell of burnt bread thick in the air. Tobin, angry and heartbroken, confronted him one morning, but Elias pulled him away before anything irreversible happened. "We don't fight battles with fire in our chest," he told the boy. "We forge steel with it. There's a difference." But not all conflicts were between lovers and fathers. One cold afternoon, a man rode into the village on a horse black as coal. He wore no crest, no badge, but demanded to see the blacksmith. He was thin, with eyes like a hawk, and he asked to inspect Elias's work. Elias, cautious, showed him a collection of finished swords and tools. The man picked up a blade, weighed it, tested its edge against a piece of cured leather. "You're better than most," he said simply. "That might be a problem." He left as suddenly as he came. No one knew his name. But that night, someone broke into the forge. Nothing was taken, just disturbed. Metal scattered. Designs stolen. The blade Elias had been secretly working on? Gone. The next morning, Tobin found a symbol drawn into the soot on the forge's wall. A circle with an X slashed through it. Elias stared at it for a long time. "That wasn't a thief," he said. "That was a warning." He had seen that mark once before, years ago, when he was a boy and his village was raided. The symbol had been carved into a door there too. That raid had taken his brother and left his mother in silence for the rest of her life. Now it had returned. To his forge, his home. Tensions in the village crept higher. The old folk muttered about curses. Children were kept inside. Farmers stopped tending the fields after dusk. The priest held extra masses, but even he seemed shaken. Elias knew the village needed protection, and blacksmiths didn't lead armies. But he also knew that iron didn't ask questions. It was forged for purpose. He gathered Wulfric and Tobin in the back room that night. "We need to prepare," he said. "Not just for an army. For something else. Something older." "What do you mean?" Tobin asked. Elias lit a candle and pulled out an old scrap of parchment. On it was the same mark that had appeared in the forge. "This isn't just a warning. It's a sign of a group that works in shadows. They don't take land or money. They take control of people, of minds. And when they show up, villages like ours don't stay the same." Wulfric leaned in. "Why you? Why now?" "I think we're being watched," Elias said. "Not for what we are, but for what we might become." He didn't say it out loud, but something told him it wasn't just the blade that had drawn attention. It was Tobin. The boy had seen something, survived something, and returned. That wasn't supposed to happen. Whoever was behind the mark, they weren't done. They had only just begun. And so, while the forge still rang with the sound of hammers, a different rhythm had begun. One of whispers of late-night watches, of steel forged not for sale, but for survival. The first snow of winter had barely melted when the rider returned. Not alone this time. Behind him came a column of men, silent, cloaked, their boots muffled in the frost. And at the head of the group rode a figure in silver armor that gleamed too brightly for such a dull day. They stopped at the edge of the village. Elias stepped outside and watched from the forge door. He wasn't ready, but he was no longer afraid. The cold didn't let up that evening. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys all across the village, and the forge glowed like a beacon in the creeping dusk. As the wind blew through the cracks in the timber-framed homes, it carried with it the scent of iron, ash, and something else, uncertainty. Thomas stood outside the forge, his eyes fixed on the path that wound its way out of the village and into the dense woods. He felt that same knot tightening in his gut again, the one he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just exhaustion or the weight of the work. It was something deeper. For weeks now, something had felt off, tools going missing, rumors about strange figures in the woods, whispers of coin being exchanged in secret corners of the tavern. In a village this small, secrets didn't stay buried long. But this one was holding on. Inside, the forge sizzled and snapped. Sparks lit up the room like fireflies as young Eli pumped the bellows with a steady rhythm. His cheeks were flushed, his brow slick with sweat, but he never slowed. He was quick to learn, and though he still stumbled with the hammer, Thomas saw something familiar in him, something like hunger. Thomas returned to the anvil, working silently. He focused on a piece of horseshoe, but his thoughts drifted. Master Ulrich had once warned him about moments like this, when instinct began whispering things logic couldn't yet explain. When the world turns quiet, Ulrich had said, "It's not peace you're hearing, it's warning." That night, the village tavern buzzed louder than usual. Farmers with frostbitten fingers clutched tankards of thick ale, while the reeve sat hunched in the corner, casting glances over parchment that looked older than the man himself. Outside, horses neighed and stomped, unsettled by the growing chill. But inside, warmth and chatter tried to keep fear at bay. A man Thomas hadn't seen before leaned against the bar, his cloak damp with snow and travel dust. He watched the room without moving much, just his eyes sweeping slowly. Eli saw him too, and nudged Thomas under the table. "You see him?" Eli whispered. Thomas nodded. Don't stare." "But he's—" "I said don't stare." Eli quickly turned back to his bread and broth. But Thomas couldn't unsee the man's boots, clean, unlike any worn by villagers. And his hands, despite the road on his cloak, didn't bear the calluses of a worker. A merchant, maybe, or a messenger. But Thomas had a feeling the stranger didn't come for coin or gossip. By morning, the man was gone, leaving behind a silver coin on the bar and a question in every villager's head. No one knew his name. No one saw where he went. But that same day, the forge's back door, the one bolted every night from inside, had been left wide open. Nothing stolen, nothing broken, just open. Thomas said nothing, but he started keeping the hammer closer at night. The work didn't stop. If anything, it grew. A new shipment of iron came earlier than expected, and the Lord's men sent word that they needed extra fittings for the armory. It was strange. Wars weren't brewing nearby. Not that anyone had heard. But orders came, and coin followed, and that was enough for most to stop asking questions. For Thomas, it only stirred the dust. Eli had questions, of course. He was 17 and hadn't yet learned the weight of holding back. Why would they need weapons now, he asked one afternoon, tossing scraps of metal into a bucket. Thomas didn't answer right away. He was fitting a blade to a wooden hilt, grinding it smooth. "Maybe they know something we don't," Thomas finally said. "You think there's trouble? There's always trouble. Just depends how close it's standing." That night, Thomas sat by the fire longer than usual. He reread the small book Master Ulrich had passed down to him years ago, one filled with notes on metalwork, but also warnings about trade, deception, and the politics of survival. One passage stood out. "The blacksmith holds power not by strength of arm, but by the need others have for his work. The need can be bartered or exploited." By the next week, another stranger had arrived. This one wore the colors of a neighboring barony, and he was much less quiet. He came into the forge and demanded service, flashing a sigil Thomas recognized but hadn't seen in years. The house of Rentham, rich in land, but poor in loyalty. I need 12 short swords. By the end of the month, the man said, his voice firm. And your discretion. Thomas studied the man's face before glancing at the parchment he placed on the bench. It bore the seal, yes, but it didn't come with a name. Who's the order for? Thomas asked. Don't ask questions that cost you your forge, the man replied. He left a small pouch of gold behind and didn't look back. Thomas stared at it for a long time. Eli eventually walked in and saw him still sitting there, unmoving. You okay? Thomas nodded slowly. Just thinking. About what? About what happens when a man forgets which fire he's stoking. The boy didn't understand, not fully. But Thomas didn't expect him to, not yet. That night, a chicken went missing, then a goat. Eli joked about wolves, but Thomas didn't laugh. It wasn't the missing animals, it was the symbols someone had carved into the stable door. Small, almost childlike lines that formed a shape he couldn't recognize. He scratched it out, but the feeling stayed. Winter deepened. The river froze, the roads turned to slick mud, and the village began to close in on itself. Food was tighter, tempers shorter. The forge stayed warm, but Thomas noticed fewer people staying to talk. Even the tavern grew quieter, like everyone had grown tired of pretending things were normal. And then came the fire. It happened 3 houses down in the dead of night. No storm, no lightning, just flames. And when the village gathered to throw water and snow on the blaze, someone whispered a name Thomas hadn't heard in years. Merrick. Merrick had been Ulrich's rival once, a blacksmith who dabbled in alchemy, who tried to fuse magic into metal. Dangerous, they said. Obsessed, until he vanished after being accused of forging blades for enemies of the king. No one ever proved it, but the whispers didn't stop. And now his name had returned with smoke. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He stood outside, near the forge, gripping his hammer with white knuckles. He watched the tree lean. He waited for nothing he could name. By morning, snow had fallen again, covered everything, even the burnt house like a blanket of denial. But the footprints leading from the trees to his forge hadn't yet disappeared. Smoke curled into the twilight sky as Osric leaned over the anvil, sweat pouring from his brow. His shoulders burned, and his palms throbbed from hours of swinging the heavy hammer. The forge hissed each time he dipped glowing iron into the barrel of water. Behind him, the bellows wheezed as his apprentice struggled to keep the fire roaring hot. Osric didn't say a word. He had learned long ago that silence in the forge was as important as heat. It was in this silence that he listened, to the sound of metal singing, to the world outside his shop, and to the growing unease settling like dust in the corners of the village. Earlier that week, a soldier had come through the narrow streets, his cloak crusted with dried blood and his eyes dull. He demanded a new sword, tossing a purse heavy with coin onto the workbench. Osric had said nothing then, only nodded and measured the man's hand for grip. But something about the encounter had stayed with him. The man's silence, the twitch in his jaw, the way he stared too long at Osric's apprentice. War was creeping closer, and with it came men hardened by it. Now, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows over the thatched rooftops, Osric caught movement outside the forge. A figure, not the usual customers, not farmers with dull plowshares or shepherds needing mending of broken hooks. This was someone wrapped in a dark cloak, standing too still. Watching, Osric wiped his hands, narrowed his eyes, and stepped outside. The cool evening breeze kissed his arms, the scent of iron and ash still clinging to his clothes. You need something? He asked, his voice low but firm. The figure stepped forward, and Osric saw it was a woman. Not young, but not old either. Her eyes were sharp, calculating. You're Osric the blacksmith, she said. He nodded once. I am. She looked past him into the warm glow of the forge. They say you worked for the king once. That true? Osric's jaw clenched. He hated when the past came walking. That was long ago. But you still make blades. I make what needs making. She stepped closer. I need a blade, not a sword. Something smaller. Something sharp enough to cut more than rope or cloth. Osric studied her face. There were no scars, no signs of battle, but her hands were worn, callous like someone who had lived hard. "What for?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her cloak and pulled out a pendant. Small, silver, etched with the symbol of the order, a group thought to be long gone. "For justice," she said. Osric's stomach sank. That symbol hadn't been seen in this part of the realm in years. The order was known for rooting out corruption, hunting down traitors, even when the line between right and wrong blurred. And if she was one of them, then something dark had stirred again in these quiet hills. He didn't ask her name. She didn't offer it. They understood each other without words. That night, long after the village had gone quiet and the inn had locked its doors, Osric reopened the forge. His apprentice slept in the corner, unaware of the fire rekindled not just in the hearth, but in Osric's blood. As sparks flew and steel hissed, Osric felt memories return. The clang of swords on stone, the cries of men falling in foreign fields, the roar of fire as cities burned. He had left that life behind, or so he thought. In the shadows, the woman waited. She said little, only watching the process with a stillness that unsettled even Osric. By morning, the blade was complete. Slim, curved, deadly. He handed it to her without ceremony. "Payment," she said, pulling out another coin pouch. Osric shook his head. "Just tell me what this is for." She hesitated, fingers tightening around the weapon. "There's a name, a man in the village. Calls himself Master Renaud, but he's no master of trade. He's from the old court, one of the king's men. He was supposed to hang for what he did." Osric's heart pounded. He knew the name. Everyone did. Renaud had come into the village a year ago, bought up land, charmed the council. No one knew much about him before that, and no one asked. That's how things worked in small places. You minded your business and stayed quiet. But now Osric understood why the forge had felt heavier these past few weeks, why the tools didn't sit right in his hands. The past had come back, cloaked in new names and smiling lies. "You'll get yourself killed," he said quietly. "Maybe," she replied, sliding the blade into her belt. "But if I don't try, who will?" As she turned to leave, Osric felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, not anger, but something heavier, a sense of responsibility. He watched her vanish into the morning mist, her silhouette swallowed by the trees. For the rest of the day, Osric worked without rest. He fixed a farmer's hoe, sharpened a butcher's cleaver, and patched a young lad's broken chain. But his mind wasn't on the work. It wandered to the woman, to the blade, to Renaud. That evening, as the sun set behind the ridge again, a rider approached. Not a villager, not a merchant. This man wore a uniform, old style, the colors of the capital, though faded with time. He dismounted and stepped into the forge with the calm arrogance of someone who knew people listened when he spoke. "You Osric?" He nodded. "I'm looking for a woman. Came through here yesterday. Wears a black cloak. May have spoken to you." Osric wiped his hands. "I speak to a lot of people." The soldier stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Don't play the fool, blacksmith. She's dangerous. She's wanted. She's not what she seems." Osric met his eyes. "None of us are." There was a long pause before the soldier turned and walked out. He didn't look back, but Osric knew he'd return. Maybe not alone next time. That night, Osric sat in the forge long after the fire died. He stared at the embers, wondering if he'd done the right thing, wondering if it even mattered anymore. The village was changing. The world was changing. And whether he liked it or not, his hammer would once again play a part in that change. Somewhere in the woods, the woman waited, watching, planning, preparing. And the blacksmith who thought he'd left it all behind was being pulled back into the fire, one glowing coal at a time. The smoke hung low that morning, curling through the trees like fingers reaching for something unseen. The forge hadn't cooled overnight. In fact, it felt hotter than usual, as if the fire had decided to stay awake and watch. Thomas stood over the embers with half-lidded eyes, his body aching, his hands blistered but still moving. Every morning began like this, dragging his sore body from his straw mattress, shaking off sleep, and returning to the only place that had ever truly defined his life, the forge. Yet that morning felt different, as if the weight of something invisible was pressing down harder than usual. Word had spread in hushed whispers. Someone had been caught stealing horses. A hanging was expected by week's end. The villagers didn't speak openly, not when passing the smithy, not when drawing water, and certainly not when the Reeves men were nearby. But Thomas noticed their eyes, wide, jittery, flicking side to side like mice avoiding the gaze of an owl. He'd seen that fear before the last purge, when suspicions and secrets spilled like boiling pitch. That time, 3 men were dragged to the square, and only one came back. He limped ever since. It wasn't just fear in the air now, it was suspicion. And Thomas knew all too well how quickly suspicion could wrap its claws around a man and pull him down. His trade, once so essential, was now being eyed with quiet doubt. They respected him, feared him even. The blacksmith's role was steeped in old magic, or so the villagers liked to believe. They trusted the blade he forged, but not always the hands that made it. His apprentice, Hal, returned mid-morning with a wild look in his eyes. "They're saying the Reeve wants new chains, heavy ones, for someone strong." His voice cracked, part from fear, part from not knowing what came next. Hal was young, barely 15, his face still round with youth, but hardened quickly by soot and heat. He was eager, loyal, but green. Too green to understand the way words twisted and burned just as easily as iron. Thomas grunted. He reached for the iron tongs and fed another bar into the fire. "Get the molds ready," he said, voice low and steady. "And keep your eyes open." As the hours passed, the hammering echoed farther than usual, bouncing off trees, stone walls, and the small chapel where Brother Samuel stood watching. Samuel had always been a quiet man of faith, kind if distant, but lately his presence at the smithy had become more frequent. He never spoke much, just stood in the doorway, watching with eyes too sharp for a man who claimed peace. Thomas didn't trust him, not fully. The priest's hands were clean, but his conscience. Thomas had his doubts. That night, the dreams returned. Visions of fire, of screaming iron, of men falling to their knees in chains he had made. A face kept appearing, familiar, yet blurred. His father's? No. Perhaps an old comrade from the war? It was always the same dream. The forge glowing red, chains snapping, and someone calling his name through the smoke. But the voice never reached him clearly. Only the fear did. Morning brought no relief. Rain had come in the night and turned the village road to mud. Hal was already there, sweeping soot from the corner, his sleeves soaked and clinging to thin arms. "Someone came last night," he said in a hush. "Left this at the door." It was a piece of parchment, rough and half-torn, but the mark on it was unmistakable, a crude drawing of a smith's hammer crossed with a noose. A warning, or worse, a threat. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Someone wanted him to know he was being watched. Closely. He tucked the parchment away and said nothing. No point stirring panic in the boy. But the message was clear. Someone believed he was involved in the theft. Maybe not of horses, but of something else. Or maybe it had nothing to do with crime. Maybe it was just fear. Fear of a man who knew how to make weapons. Fear of someone who lived too close to the flame. That afternoon, a stranger came to the forge. Hooded, tall, not from the village. His voice was calm but cold. "I hear you make more than plowshares." Thomas didn't blink. "I make what people need." The man placed a coin on the table, silver, foreign. "I need a blade. Quiet. Fast. No names." Thomas stared at the coin, then at the man. "You're not from here. Neither is trouble. But it finds its way." The man didn't stay long. Just enough to give the specifications, just enough to leave something unsaid hanging in the air like smoke. Thomas knew the type. Mercenary. Hire blade. Someone tied to nobility or someone hunting them. Trouble, either way. The moment he accepted that coin, he knew his hands were no longer clean. But they hadn't been for years, had they? Hal watched the stranger go, his young eyes wide with questions he didn't dare ask. "Should we make it?" he finally whispered. Thomas didn't answer right away. He stared into the forge, watching the flames curl around the iron. "We've already started," he said finally. "Now we finish." But the village was shifting. Even the trees seemed to lean differently. Whispers carried further. Children stopped playing near the smithy, and the Reeves men passed by more often, always with a glance, always with a hand resting a little too close to their swords. Late one night, a knock came at the door. Thomas opened it to find a woman soaked in rain, her eyes wild. It was Maeve, the healer. She rarely left her hut after sunset. They took Jorik, she said. Said he confessed. But I know he didn't. He was with me. Thomas let her in. She shivered near the fire as she spoke in broken gasps. They're blaming the wrong ones. And they'll come for you soon. They think the smith makes more than tools. Her words echoed in his ears long after she'd gone. He had once sworn never to take sides again. Not after the war. Not after burying too many friends. But silence was no longer safe. He could feel it. Feel the ground shifting beneath the village like something ancient stirring in the soil. He returned to the forge that night. Not to sleep. Not to rest. But to begin. Something was coming, and whether he liked it or not, he would be at the center of it. The blacksmith, once the quiet heartbeat of the village, was now its most dangerous secret, and the fire never went out. The days leading into the annual Forge Festival were heavy with unease. Every clang of hammer against metal inside the smithy now echoed with more urgency, and every spark that flew from the anvil seemed to mirror the rising tension that gripped the village. For Edric, the blacksmith, time felt like a blade slowly dragging against stone, wearing thin, sparking under pressure, but not yet breaking. Word had spread through the narrow dirt paths that something was wrong at the mines. Men were returning early, some coughing violently, others limping, and one with eyes wide as if he'd seen something no one should. Edric noticed fewer iron deliveries, and when he went to ask, the guards at the edge of the forested hills simply said, "The mine's under royal hold." No questions. That was never a good sign. And yet, despite the whispers of trouble, he had work to finish. There were tools to sharpen, weapons to repair, and his mind could not afford the luxury of panic. Not with his apprentice Edric asking questions he didn't know how to answer. The Forge Festival wasn't just a celebration. It was an inspection. The Baron and his officials would walk among the smiths, take inventory of tools and armor, and judge who had value and who had fallen behind. One year, an old blacksmith had failed to meet quota and disappear by winter. Some said he was taken to work for free in the deeper forges near the coast. Others whispered darker things. Edric didn't care for gossip, but he understood the stakes. What made it worse was the arrival of a strange visitor days before the event. A man wrapped in dark linen, with gloved hands and a hood pulled low, came into Edric's smithy not to buy, but to observe. He didn't speak much. He just watched. His eyes followed every movement, from the swing of the hammer to the quenching of red-hot iron in the barrel. He finally said one thing before leaving. "Keep the forge hot. The crown is watching." It left Edric rattled, not because the words were threatening, but because they felt like a warning from someone who didn't want to say more. He didn't sleep well that night. The sounds of the forge still rang in his ears long after the fires had gone out, and in the middle of the night, he thought he saw a flicker of movement outside his home, like a figure passing between shadows. Edric, the boy apprentice, had been different too, less playful, more focused, and yet more distracted at times, often glancing toward the hills where the mine lay. One morning, after a particularly bad delivery, cracked iron and rusted chunks, Edric confronted him. The boy admitted he'd gone to the edge of the mine trail with his friend to spy. He said they saw carts filled with something strange, rock that glowed faintly in the dark, covered in cloth and guarded like treasure. When one miner dropped a piece, his hand blistered almost instantly. "It wasn't iron," Edric whispered. "It wasn't anything natural." Edric scolded him, but deep down, he believed him. Things were changing. He could feel in his bones, the way blacksmiths do when metal doesn't behave right or the wind shifts before a storm. It wasn't just about forge quotas or the fear of failing the Baron's inspection. There was something deeper stirring, something dangerous, something hidden. Meanwhile, tensions in the village were building too. The miller's son had disappeared, last seen heading toward the mine looking for his father. The baker's wife said soldiers had warned her not to ask questions. And at the well one morning, two women were whispering about strange noises at night. Low humming sounds like wind through hollow stone. The Forge Festival drew closer. Edric worked non-stop, his hands blistered and calloused, his arms aching from hammering through faulty iron. He barely ate, barely spoke. The village buzzed with activity, but beneath the smiles and song rehearsals, people were afraid. The blacksmiths were the busiest, their work judged more harshly than any other. A bad sword could mean death on the battlefield. A weak axe could cost a soldier's life. A mistake in the forge wasn't just a personal failure. It was treason. One evening, as the sun bled orange over the village rooftops, Edric heard knocking at his smithy door. Not pounding, just soft, rhythmic knocks. He opened it to find the same cloaked man from before. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 others stood behind him, both armed, both silent. The man handed Edric a scroll, sealed with the Baron's crest. "Forge this," he said, pulling back the cloth to reveal a strange metal shard. It was heavier than steel, darker than iron, and shimmered slightly under the forge light. "Say nothing to anyone, not even your apprentice. This order comes from the throne." Edric wanted to ask questions, but the man's eyes silenced him. They left without another word. Edric unrolled the scroll. It was written in formal language, but the meaning was clear. The crown had discovered a new, or one not found in the usual lands, and it was to be shaped into weapons secretly. No record, no marks, no trace. And if he refused, it would be considered betrayal. He stood there for a long time, the strange metal in his hands, thinking about the glowing rock the miners had tried to hide, thinking about the sick men who'd returned, thinking about Edric's curiosity and the boy's safety. This wasn't blacksmithing anymore. This was something else. He worked by moonlight for the next 2 nights, alone. He locked the doors, covered the windows, and hid the new material beneath layers of coal when not using it. The metal didn't behave like iron. It sparked too brightly, cooled too fast, and rang with an eerie pitch when struck. He didn't like it, but he did as ordered. By the 3rd night, Edric grew suspicious. The boy was smart, and his questions became harder to deflect. That evening, Edric found him snooping around the storage corner, nearly discovering the covered ore. He pulled the boy aside and told him sharply to stop. "Why?" Edric asked, his voice trembling. "What's going on?" Edric didn't answer. He couldn't, but the damage was done. Edric knew something was very wrong. The next morning, Edric woke to find the strange metal missing. And Edric was gone. The forge was still warm, the anvil still stained from last night's work, but the shard, along with the scroll, had vanished. Panic gripped him harder than any flame ever had. If the guards came and found it missing, it wouldn't matter whether he'd forged it or not. He'd be blamed. He rushed through the village, asking if anyone had seen the boy. No one had. The boy's small satchel and worn leather boots were also gone from the corner where he kept them. Only one place made sense: the mines. Edric's heart thundered as he grabbed his hammer, not as a tool, but as a weapon, and set off toward the forest trail, past the warning signs, past the ash trees that bent toward the path like mourners. He didn't know what he'd find, but he knew nothing good waited ahead. The Forge Festival would begin in 2 days, and everything was about to break. The forge was no longer just a place for shaping iron. It had become something more, something like a confessional, a war room, and a prison all at once. Each clang of the hammer echoed like a heartbeat, steady and tense. The blacksmith's life, already full of hard labor and quiet endurance, now bristled with the weight of secrets and unseen eyes. Every villager who stepped through the threshold seemed to carry more than just broken tools or rusted nails. Some carried messages, some carried fear, and some, like the cloaked figure who arrived just before dusk, carried danger. The man didn't speak at first. He simply set a length of warped steel on the anvil and waited. His eyes, barely visible beneath his hood, scanned the walls of the forge like he was checking for something or someone. Thomas felt the tension twist in his stomach. He wasn't sure if it was instinct or paranoia anymore. He worked the metal slowly, glancing up between strikes. The man still didn't speak, but he didn't leave either. Finally, the blacksmith broke the silence. "You here for a blade or a bribe?" The man tilted his head slightly, then stepped forward and leaned in just close enough to be heard over the hiss of steam. "Neither," he whispered. but you've made something dangerous." Thomas blinked, pretending not to understand. "You'll have to be clearer. I make a lot of dangerous things. It's kind of the job." The man didn't laugh. "The mark, the symbol in the pommel. You know the one I mean." And just like that, the heat in the room had nothing to do with the fire. Thomas's heart thumped. The symbol, the hidden one he'd stamped on the dagger weeks ago, at the request of a young noble who wouldn't give his name, was supposed to be unnoticed, secret, meaningless to anyone who wasn't involved. But this man knew, and that meant others probably did too. "You're mistaken," Thomas said carefully, trying not to betray the shaking in his voice. "I engrave what I'm paid to engrave. I don't ask questions." "No," the man replied, "but you should start." He left without another word, vanishing into the night like smoke from the forge. Thomas stood there, the hammer hanging useless in his hand, the sweat on his brow suddenly cold. Over the following days, things only grew stranger. The innkeeper's wife asked for a new lock on her cellar door. The old priest wanted iron bars installed on the chapel windows. A pair of guards came in with bent spear shafts, but kept exchanging glances like they were trying to memorize the shop. And then there were the children. They had stopped playing near the forge. Even their laughter felt like it had been muffled by something heavier in the air, something no one dared speak about. Despite the unease, Thomas kept working. The forge was his rhythm, his escape. But that rhythm was beginning to falter. Sleepless nights, fleeting shadows outside the shutters, whispers that stopped the moment he stepped into the tavern. He wasn't imagining it. Something was shifting, and he was tangled in it whether he liked it or not. Then one evening, the boy returned. Aiden, barely 13, thin as a reed, but with eyes too sharp for his age. He had once run errands for Thomas, and now he slipped back into the forge like he belonged there. He said nothing for a while, just watched the sparks dance. "They're saying someone important was killed," he muttered after a moment. "Noble blood. Sword with a blacksmith's mark on it." Thomas didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence said enough. Aiden kicked at the straw on the floor. "They think it's you. Or, at least, that you knew what you were making." "And do you?" Thomas asked. Aiden nodded. "I think you made it because you had no choice." Thomas studied the boy. He was too young to understand how little choice a man like him really had. The noble class could crush him without lifting a finger. The guilds wouldn't protect him. The villagers wouldn't dare stand beside him if it meant risking their land or lives. And yet, here was this boy, standing with him anyway. But loyalty wouldn't save either of them. That night, Thomas buried the dagger he'd been hiding. Not the same one he made weeks ago, but another, nearly identical, with the same twisted symbol in its pommel. He buried it beneath the roots of the oldest tree in the woods, deep enough that even he'd struggle to find it again. Not out of guilt, but because he had a feeling more questions were coming, and answers were becoming dangerous. When he returned, someone had been in the forge. Nothing was missing, nothing broken, but the tools had been moved just slightly, like someone unfamiliar had tried to put them back exactly as they'd found them. His forge fire had gone cold. His cat was gone, and the hammer he used daily was now resting on the wrong hook. He sat for a long time in silence. The iron cooled in the open air. The room smelled of ash and old secrets. The next day, the mayor visited, dressed in silk despite the dust on the road. He wore the expression of a man trying to look like he didn't fear anyone. But he kept glancing toward the shadows as if expecting something to lunge from them. He asked questions in circles about weapons, about visitors, about loyalty to the crown. Thomas gave him answers with no corners to grip. It wasn't lying. It was surviving. "You understand," the mayor said with forced politeness. "In times like these, any man who makes weapons makes enemies." Thomas nodded. "I understand that well." The mayor left unsatisfied, and Thomas knew he'd be back, with guards next time. Or worse. By dusk, the forge door was bolted. The windows shuttered. Thomas worked by the low glow of a single oil lamp. The steady rhythm of the hammer, now a slow heartbeat of dread. Each weapon he made now carried more than weight. They carried meaning, allegiance, blame. The blacksmith's life had never been easy. But now it felt like a game played blindfolded, with rules that changed daily and punishment that came without warning. He tried not to think of the noble who commissioned the first blade, or the way his hands had trembled when he'd asked for that symbol, or how quickly he disappeared once the work was done. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of hooves on the road. More visitors, or maybe watchers. Thomas didn't look up. He didn't need to. Whatever was coming, it had already begun. The storm hadn't passed. If anything, it grew heavier, not just in the skies, but inside Ulrich's mind. His hands, still stained from hours of toil, gripped the wooden beam near his forge as he leaned forward, trying to breathe through the whirlwind of thoughts battering his skull. The soldiers who came asking questions weren't just passing by, and he knew it now. They were watching, waiting. By morning, the forge didn't even smell like smoke. It reeked of tension. Ingrid barely spoke, and when she did, it was only in short phrases as if words were rationed like grain. The children had been sent to stay with the miller's family outside the village. They thought it would be temporary, but something told Ulrich this wasn't the kind of storm you could wait out with silence and patience. He had finished shaping the horseshoes for the bailiff's new mount when the boy arrived, a young apprentice from Smithy 2 towns over. He looked pale and nervous, with wind-tossed hair and a cloak far too thin for the cold. Ulrich met him at the door, a quiet stare holding back the worry in his gut. "They sent me to warn you," the boy whispered, his voice cracking. "There's a list. They're drawing names. You're near the top." Ulrich didn't move, didn't breathe. A list? For what? And why was his name on it? The boy wouldn't, or couldn't, say more. He just trembled and stared like someone who had heard too much and understood too little. When the boy left, Ingrid came out from behind the curtain, eyes wide and full of knowing. "You have to choose now," she said simply. "Do we stay, or do we run?" He didn't answer, not because he hadn't thought of it, but because both choices felt like defeat. That night, unable to sleep, Ulrich went back to the forge. The coals were still warm, flickering like restless thoughts. He stared into them, searching for answers in the embers like a man who believed fire might speak. And in a way it did. He thought of everything he'd built, not just the tools and weapons, but the trust of his people, the rhythm of his days, the quiet moments shared with his children under the stars. Would all of it be worth nothing if he fled? Or would it all be taken from him anyway? The sound of hoofbeats cut through his thoughts. Again, only this time, it wasn't a patrol, it was a single rider. Cloaked, hooded, fast. Ulrich stepped outside into the freezing dark, and the rider slowed only slightly before leaping off the horse and tossing a heavy satchel at Ulrich's feet. Then, without a word, the figure turned and galloped away, the hooves pounding out a warning. Inside the satchel was metal, not coins, but something far more dangerous. Armor, bent, bloodied. Ulrich lifted it with trembling hands. It was the breastplate of a noble's guard. Deep gash in the side, burn marks near the collar, a crack running straight across the front, and on the inside, a smear of dried blood still clung to the leather straps. He turned to Ingrid, whose face had gone pale. This isn't ours," she whispered, but someone had made sure it would look like it was. The message was clear. Someone wanted the crown's men to think Ulrich had forged the armor for the enemy, maybe even helped destroy one of their own. It wasn't just suspicion now. It was entrapment. By morning, the village was stirring, but not in the usual sleepy rhythm. There were murmurs, shadows cast by gossip and fear. The local tanner claimed to have seen strangers near the smithy in the night. The widow who sold eggs at the market said soldiers had questioned her about Ulrich. And someone else, a name he never learned, had told the bailiff that Ulrich was hiding something. He wasn't sure who had started it. He only knew it was spreading. And soon, the people he had helped for years were starting to look at him like he was dangerous. To make matters worse, the nobleman from the next county, Lord Rorik, arrived that afternoon. With him came a full escort of armed riders. They didn't ask permission to enter. They rode straight to the center of the village, where the bailiff, the priest, and the merchant's guild master met them under nervous glances. Ulrich stayed hidden behind his forge, eyes narrowed as he listened. Lord Rorik's voice carried across the square. "There's a traitor here, someone working with outlaws, selling arms to men who've turned against the realm. I intend to find out who it is." It wasn't subtle. It wasn't careful. It was meant to stir the pot, to make neighbors question each other, to make someone, somewhere, break and speak. Ulrich didn't wait to be found. That night, under the guise of checking the bellows, he slipped out the back and went to the abandoned stone bridge outside the village. There, in the thick fog and biting cold, he met with someone he hadn't seen in years, an old soldier named Ewald, who had once stood guard beside Ulrich during the last great border raid. Ewald didn't wear armor anymore. He wore a tattered cloak, a bitter smile, and a knife strapped to his thigh. "You're not safe," Ewald said after listening to everything. "Someone's setting you up, and they've got reach. Nobles, merchants, even priests. You've made enemies. Ulrich, maybe without even knowing it." Ulrich clenched his fists. "I never asked for power. I never asked for anything beyond my forge." "That's the problem," Ewald said. "You stood still while the rest of them played games. And now they're trying to use you like one of your tools." Ulrich didn't want to believe it, but he couldn't deny it anymore. The trap had been set long before the armor arrived at his door. It had been creeping in for years. Every time he turned away from politics, every time he gave a tool to someone who used it for something dark. It wasn't enough to be neutral. Not in times like these. As they parted ways, Ewald handed Ulrich something wrapped in cloth. Inside was a symbol etched into iron, a mark used by a secret group of outlaws known as the Hollow Suns. Their presence in the region had been denied for years, but whispers of their influence were everywhere. The armor in the satchel, it bore the same mark. Subtle, hidden, but there. The question wasn't whether Ulrich had worked with them. He hadn't. The question was, who had used his tools to arm them? And why pin the blame on him now? He returned to the village just before dawn, heart pounding, body numb. He didn't sleep. He couldn't, because he knew, sometime soon, someone would come knocking. But what he didn't know was that someone already had. And they weren't knocking. They were already inside, watching, waiting for the moment he would break, or fight back, because either way, they planned to win. And in the distance, as the sun barely began to rise, the sound of the church bells rang out. Not for worship, for war. A shiver ran through Wulfric's spine as he stood in the dim glow of his forge, the fire inside cracking louder than usual. The air had shifted. It wasn't the kind of change you could see. It was the kind you felt deep in your bones. Rumors had begun to spread through the village like wildfire. At first, it was whispers at the tavern and sideways glances in the marketplace. But now, people were saying it aloud. Someone was sabotaging the smithy. And worse, someone from the manor was asking questions about Wulfric's dealings. He hadn't slept well in days. Between the demands of his work, the injury to his arm that still hadn't fully healed, and the weight of fear that something unseen was creeping into his life, his body was running on instinct. The nightmares had returned too. Dark dreams of fire, twisted metal, and a shadowy figure watching him from across the village square. The forge, once his place of control and purpose, had become a cage of uncertainty. The iron felt heavier. The bellows wheezed like a dying breath. Every sound echoed too long. Still, he worked because that was all he knew, and because if he stopped, he might never start again. A loud knock startled him. He turned, heart thudding against his ribs. It was still early. Not many would be brave enough to visit him at this hour, not when most villagers preferred to keep their distance these days. He wiped his hands on his apron and opened the heavy wooden door. It was Aldwin, the Reeve's son, a boy barely 16, tall and wiry, with eyes that carried a nervous intelligence. He looked over his shoulder before stepping in, his voice barely above a whisper. "They know about the blade," Aldwin said. Wulfric didn't answer at first. He simply stared, trying to will the words away. But they clung to the air like soot. "I saw one of the steward's men talking with Osric behind the granary," Aldwin continued. He had a scroll in his hand. Looked official. "They're asking questions about where that steel came from, the one you gave to the hunter. The blade." Wulfric's heart sank. Months ago, he had forged a weapon from an unusual piece of, or brought to him by a traveler who claimed it fell from the sky. It wasn't like anything he'd worked with before. It didn't behave like iron or steel. It was smoother, sharper, as if it remembered what it wanted to be. He'd given the finished blade to a hunter in exchange for meat during a particularly cruel winter, never expecting it to draw attention. But someone had noticed. Someone with power. Why are you telling me this? Wulfric asked. Aldwin glanced at the flickering forge. Because my father used to trust you. Because he said you were a good man, once. Before all this. Wulfric clenched his jaw. Get back before someone sees you here. The boy hesitated, then disappeared into the misty morning, his footsteps soft on the damp earth. That night, Wulfric stayed late in the forge. He couldn't stop thinking about the blade, about the strange metal, about the man who'd given it to him. The traveler had been covered in dust, his accent foreign, and he'd warned Wulfric not to ask too many questions. This metal, he had said, doesn't belong in this world. Back then, Wulfric had thought it nonsense, just a desperate man trying to barter for food and shelter. But now, with the rumors circling and the manor watching, those words haunted him. He reopened the locked chest at the back of the forge, the one he hadn't touched in months. Inside, beneath layers of burlap, was the second shard of the mysterious metal. He'd kept it hidden, unsure of what to do with it. As he touched its cool surface, it pulsed faintly like a living thing. No rust, no age, no sign of wear. Just perfect, alien sharpness. Wulfric wasn't alone for long. A soft knock sounded on the back door, this one even softer than Aldwin's. He opened it cautiously, and there stood Mara, the herbwoman's apprentice. She was drenched from the rain, her cloak clinging to her frame. Her face was pale, and her eyes wide with urgency. "They've taken the hunter," she whispered. Wulfric stiffened. "When?" "An hour ago. A patrol dragged him from his home. Said they were arresting him for possessing forbidden arms. I only caught a glimpse, but I swear one of the guards was holding the blade you made." Wulfric felt his throat tighten. This was no longer a quiet threat. It was action. The manor wasn't just curious. They were afraid. Or worse, they wanted the metal for themselves. Mara stepped into the forge and lowered her voice. "You have to leave. Tonight. If they link the blade to you." "I can't leave," he said, his voice rough. "This is my forge. My home." She looked around. "It's just a building. They'll burn it if they have to, and they'll call it justice." He turned back to the forge fire, the heat warming his face but not his heart. "And what then? I run, become some nameless smith in a strange town? With this cursed metal?" Mara looked at the shard in his hand. "Maybe it's not cursed. Maybe it's the key." "To what?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But it's not from here. And that means it doesn't follow their rules. Maybe it doesn't have to follow their laws, either." Thunder rumbled in the distance. The forge flickered as the wind slipped through the cracks in the walls. Wulfric stared into the flames and felt something stirring inside him. Not fear this time, but resolve. The metal was part of something bigger. Something ancient, maybe even forbidden. But it had found its way to him for a reason. He didn't believe in fate, but he believed in craft. And he knew that some things weren't made. They were revealed. By dawn, the forge was cold. Wulfric had doused the fire, packed what little he could carry, and hidden the shard inside a hollowed-out hammer. He left no note, no goodbye, just silence. Mara watched him from the edge of the woods, her horse ready. "Where will we go?" "South," he said, "to the old cities, where no one remembers my name. And if they come after us..." Wulfric gave a small, grim smile. "Then they'll find a blacksmith who's no longer afraid to fight." And with that, they disappeared into the mist, the first light of dawn painting the sky with streaks of iron and fire. But behind them, in the stillness of the forge, something moved. A faint shimmer in the ashes. A pulse. The kind that didn't belong to this world. By the time the leaves had turned golden and the harvest festivals echoed in the distance, Magnus barely recognized his own hands. The skin was blackened with soot, callous thick like tree bark. Every night, he lay awake in a cramped loft above the forge, his thoughts circling like wolves around the same worry. How much longer could he keep up with the demands of both his lord and the town? With every noble's warhorse that lost a shoe, every broken plow that came through the door, he saw his time slipping like cold dust between his fingers. Meanwhile, rumors from the northern border grew louder. Whispers of raiders crossing the river in search of weak villages to pillage before winter locked the land. Magnus, like many blacksmiths in medieval Europe, was more than just a craftsman. He was a supplier of defense. Without his iron, swords would dull, hinges would snap, armor would fail. And in that fragile balance between peace and chaos, Magnus Forge had suddenly become the town's beating heart. But it was also a target. One chilly evening, as a faint drizzle softened the packed earth, a hooded stranger appeared at Magnus Forge just after dusk. The fire had nearly gone out, and Magnus was preparing to close when he noticed the figure standing silent near the anvil. No knock, no greeting, just the smell of wet wool and the silence of someone who didn't belong. "You need something?" Magnus asked, drying his hands on a rough cloth, already eyeing the iron poker within reach. The stranger removed his hood slowly, revealing a face Magnus hadn't seen in 10 years. It was Auric, once a village boy like himself, now clearly aged beyond his years. Scars cut across one cheek, and his left eye was clouded white. "You shouldn't be here," Magnus whispered, breath catching. "I need your help," Auric said simply. The past slammed into Magnus like a falling hammer. Auric had vanished years ago after being accused of stealing from Lord Weller's manor. Everyone assumed he had fled or died in the woods. But here he was, standing in the dying light of Magnus Forge, looking like he'd been dragged through war. Magnus didn't speak. He turned and fed the embers, needing something to distract his hands. Auric didn't move. "They're coming south, Magnus. Faster than the lords admit. They burn the forges first. Without steel, the villages can't resist. You got to make a choice soon." Magnus clenched the iron tongs. "I've got contracts. Families rely on this forge. And when the raiders come, contracts won't mean anything when you're kneeling in your own ashes." That night, Magnus couldn't sleep. Auric had left as quietly as he'd arrived, vanishing into the fog with nothing but a warning. The sound of metal striking metal echoed in Magnus' skull like distant war drums. The brutal reality of a medieval blacksmith's life was never just shaping steel. It was surviving the sharp edges of politics, war, and betrayal. For the next week, Magnus watched the roads more closely. He kept the forge burning longer into the night, but the work took a new direction. In secret, he began forging long iron spikes, carefully crafting weapons instead of tools. When the villagers came by for repairs, he still patched their buckets and fixed their tools. But behind closed shutters, he was preparing for something darker. Then came another twist. A messenger from the Baron himself rode into the village just before the frost, bearing not a scroll, but a chest. Inside were 12 pounds of silver, more than Magnus had ever seen at once. And with it, a sealed order. "Forge 60 blades for the Baron's new militia. Rush order. Double time. No questions. 60. Magnus' heart sank. He looked at the silver, then at the hands that would have to earn it. Days would become a blur of hammering, quenching, grinding. Food would be eaten at the bench. Sleep would be stolen between cooling cycles. But what troubled him wasn't the work. It was who those swords might end up in the hands of. "What do you think they're preparing for?" whispered Elric, the boy who swept Magnus' forge and fetched water when his arms gave out. Magnus shook his head. "Nothing good. Will you make them?" "I don't have a choice. The people needed that silver." Magnus knew that without it, the forge might not last the winter. And yet, deep inside, he couldn't shake Auric's warning. If the northern raiders reached them, and if those swords were already pledged to the Baron's elite, what would be left for the villagers? That tension gnawed at him as the days slipped by. Sparks flew, iron shrieked under the hammer, and black smoke rolled through the thatched roof. His world shrank to fire and steel, sweat and silence. Sleep became something he feared. Too many dreams of his village burning, of children crying in alleys while noblemen rode away on armored horses. One night, with only a dozen blades left to finish, he heard something strange. Whispers through the trees behind the forge. Magnus froze mid-strike, letting the red-hot sword cool on the anvil. The whispers grew louder. Not drunken laughter. Not foxes in the leaves. Voices in a tongue he didn't recognize. He crept outside, poker in hand, heart pounding like his bellows. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, he saw movement, figures slinking low, avoiding torchlight, watching the forge. He backed away slowly, heart in his throat. By the next morning, they were gone. No tracks, no damage, just silence. But Magnus knew what he'd seen. Raiders didn't announce themselves with banners. They watched, waited, tested. He had become a mark. He doubled the night shifts, now working in shifts with the help of Elric and an older apprentice, Thomas. The forge became a fortress, its door reinforced, the windows barred with scrap iron. Word spread through the village, and soon farmers were asking if Magnus had anything they could use, anything sharp, anything steel. And so he began to hide a few blades. Just a few. Enough to arm a handful of men in case the worst came. He knew it was dangerous. The Baron's silver was still unfinished. If the wrong person found out, he could be hanged. But the people needed something to believe in. And then, as the first snow fell, the second twist hit. Alric returned, but this time not alone. He came with two others, dressed like mercenaries but worn thin, faces lined with frost and fear. They brought news. 2 neighboring villages had been raided and wiped clean. No survivors. The enemy didn't just burn forges now. They took blacksmiths with them. They're building their own armies, Alric explained. Taking your kind by force. You're not safe here anymore. Magnus felt the walls closing in. The Baron's messengers would be back any day to collect their weapons. The raiders were on the move. And if they knew who he was, where he worked, the forge was no longer a place of creation. It had become a crucible of dread. He looked at Elric and Thomas. Young, scared, loyal. They had trusted him. They still did. Magnus knew one thing. There was no turning back. The question was, how much more would he have to sacrifice to keep the fire burning? As the sun set behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the village, the forge's glow flickered like a heartbeat in the night. Wulfric stood outside, the air still heavy with the day's heat and the bitter sting of smoke. He rubbed his aching hands together, raw and darkened from years of toil, and stared at the house where the magistrate's men had earlier questioned him. No one had returned since, but something didn't feel right. The silence was too deep, as though the village itself was holding its breath. That evening, Elric hadn't come home. The boy was known to wander, especially down to the riverbank or the edge of the woods, but he always came back by dusk, especially after what happened to Tomas. Wulfric had warned him, maybe even too harshly, but he couldn't afford to be gentle in times like these. The village was changing, and not for the better. Folk no longer smiled when passing. Eyes darted quickly away from anything unfamiliar. Rumors, once quiet whispers, had grown louder. Something old, something unspoken, seemed to be crawling out of the shadows again. Wulfric picked up the iron poker by the hearth and stepped into the dark. He passed the silent forge, the warmth from its core now a faint memory under the moonlight. He walked through the narrow lanes, past shuttered windows and locked doors, listening for any sign of his son. The gravel crunched underfoot, each step echoing in his ears. At the edge of the village, where the thatched roofs gave way to the wild hedgerows, he found the path Elric favored. The wind picked up, rustling the trees with a hollow hiss. Wulfric paused, eyes adjusting to the shadows dancing beneath the branches. Something moved. Not fast, not far, just enough to catch his attention. He gripped the poker tighter and moved toward it, heart racing with a mix of fear and purpose. Near the riverbank, half hidden in tall grass, he found the boy's wooden toy sword. It was chipped at the edges, the leather-wrapped hilt worn from use. Elric never let it out of his sight. Wulfric knelt beside it, fingers grazing the damp ground. No blood, no signs of struggle. But the sword being here, alone, meant something had gone wrong. He scanned the tree-lean, mouth dry, and shouted into the dark. Elric! His voice broke the stillness like a hammer against stone. No reply. He shouted again, this time louder. Birds scattered from the branches, and somewhere in the distance, a low creak groaned like old wood shifting under weight. He stepped deeper into the trees, the branches thickening overhead, swallowing the moonlight. A shape darted between the trunks. Elric! He hurried after it, heart pounding harder than a blacksmith's hammer. The shape stopped just ahead, barely visible, then turned. Not Elric. Too tall, too thin. Its face was pale, like bone wrapped in shadows. Then it disappeared again. Wulfric froze. The air around him changed, cooler now, unnaturally still. He backed away slowly, eyes scanning the dark, every instinct screaming to turn and run. But he couldn't leave. Not without Elric. Not knowing what that thing was. He moved forward again, slowly now, careful not to snap any twigs beneath his boots. Each breath came heavy. Deeper into the woods, he found an old trail, barely visible, as though nature had tried to erase it. His father had once warned him of this place, called it cursed, said no good came from paths that refused to be remembered. But tonight he had no choice. He followed it. Meanwhile, back in the village, whispers were spreading. The smith was seen entering the forest, they said. Alone, after dark. Some muttered prayers, others just locked their doors tighter. Everyone remembered what happened years ago, what started the last time someone disappeared. They remembered the dreams, the voices, the fire. The magistrate returned by torchlight, finding no sign of Wulfric. Only the forge stood there, tools laid out, as if the smith had simply stepped away. The coals were cold. Back in the forest, Wulfric reached an opening. Moonlight poured into the clearing like silver water, and in the center stood a stone. Not just any stone, one carved with runes so old, he barely recognized them. But he remembered his grandfather's stories, told in whispers by the hearth when no one else could hear. Stories of a forgotten pact between the village and whatever lurked in the woods before the church was ever built. Elric was nowhere in sight. But Wulfric knew, in his gut, this was connected. The dreams, the silence, the missing children, the unrest among the animals, the broken tools, the strange man with hollow eyes who came asking about Tomas. Something was waking. The wind shifted again, carrying a voice. Soft, faint. Father, it was Elric. He turned sharply, scanning the trees. Elric, where are you? No answer. Just the wind again. And then a flash of movement near the far side of the clearing. He ran. Branches whipped his face as he charged into the undergrowth, ignoring the sting and scratch. He stumbled down a slope, knees striking a root, pain shooting through his leg. But he got up bloodied and breathless. At the bottom, a cave. Small, almost hidden, just wide enough for a child. Or was something pretending to be one. He hesitated, staring into the dark hole, the smell of damp earth and something else, something older, wafting up from within. Elric, a faint echo, then a scraping sound. Wulfric crawled in, the poker held in front of him like a spear. The tunnel twisted downward, the walls slick with moss. Far below, he could hear a sound, water dripping, and something else, breathing, but not human. He reached a chamber, empty, and then a sound from behind. The tunnel he just crawled through had shifted. Stones now blocked the way back. The air grew colder. In the distance, deeper in the darkness, a low, guttural growl rumbled through the earth. Something was here with him, and whatever it was, it knew he had come. The hammer came down again, clang, clang, hiss, sending sparks in every direction as the blacksmith's sweat soaked through his tunic. For days, Oswin had thrown himself into the forge with a kind of madness. He barely ate, barely slept. Each blade he made was sharper than the last, but it wasn't about the weapons anymore. It was about what they symbolized: control, redemption, resistance. The whispers in the town square about the coming tax, the second harvest tithe, and the Lord's levy were no longer just noise. They had become sparks in Oswin's mind, tiny flames threatening to ignite into something larger. Thorn visited again, this time not with his usual mocking grin, but with a quiet urgency. Oswin, he said, ducking inside the forge. There's movement at the keep. The soldiers aren't just training, they're arming up. Word is the tax isn't coming next month. It's coming in 2 days. Oswin didn't stop working. He'd known something was wrong when the village reeve had come sniffing around last night, pretending to buy horseshoes while glancing at Oswin's anvil and the tools by the wall. They'll take more than grain this time, Thorn added, stepping closer, voice low. They'll take livestock. They'll take metal. And if they think you've been holding back, they'll take that too. Oswin finally stopped and turned to him. His face was tired, eyes darker than usual. Then I won't be here when they come. Thorn blinked. What are you saying? I'm going to the old hill fort, Oswin said. I'm going to speak with the others. You mean? Thorn hesitated. You mean the men who ran? The ones living in the woods? Oswin nodded. They weren't cowards. They saw what was coming before the rest of us. And I think they've been waiting for someone to bring them something to fight with. It took hours to prepare. Oswin wrapped the blades carefully in old cloth, packed them in a cart beneath rusty plow parts to disguise them, and left before dawn. The air was crisp, and mist hung low over the fields. As he moved past the edge of the village, he glanced back once. At the forge, the chimney still puffing smoke, the iron horseshoe nailed above the door. He wondered if he'd ever see it again. The path to the woods was narrow and winding, made worse by the recent rains. The cart wheels stuck in the mud. More than once, he had to stop and pull them free. But he pressed on, deeper into the trees, until the sounds of the village faded behind him. The men who met him wore furs and hardened leather, their faces lined by wind and worry. At first, they surrounded him, blades drawn, suspicious of his sudden arrival. But when he threw back the cloth and revealed what he had brought, everything changed. You made these? One of them asked, lifting a sword from the bundle. It was lighter than expected, perfectly balanced. Oswin nodded. I made them for us. The leader, a man named Edric, stepped forward. What do you want in return? I want to stop watching children go hungry while the Lord feasts. I want to stop paying with my sweat so he can build his stone towers. I want to take back what we once had. Silence followed. A heavy moment passed between them. Then Edric gave a single nod. Then you're not just a blacksmith anymore. Over the next day and night, plans were made. The men knew the paths, the guards' rotations, even the weaknesses in the keep's outer wall. They didn't talk about taking the whole castle, only what was needed to send a message. Supplies, grain, proof that they wouldn't be silent anymore. Oswin spent the night tending to the weapons, sharpening each edge by firelight. For the first time, he felt something settle in his chest, a mix of fear and clarity. This was no longer about holding back. It was about stepping forward. When the group approached the outskirts of the village again, cloaked by the pre-dawn dark, they moved like shadows. Thorn had gathered a few trusted locals who were ready. The church bell rang early, not for prayer, but as a signal. Then everything moved fast. The grain storeroom near the mill was the first target. Edric's men overwhelmed the guards quickly, without spilling blood. Oswin and Thorn broke open the doors and began passing out sacks to waiting hands. Mothers, farmers, children who had gone too long without enough. But at the keep, everything changed. A second patrol, one no one had accounted for, returned early from a distant village. They spotted the cart outside the granary and rushed in, swords raised. In the chaos that followed, Oswin was forced to fight not just for survival, but for everything they'd planned. Steel clashed in the night air. One of the rebels fell. Thorn was nearly struck before Oswin blocked the blow. His arms burned, muscles aching, but he didn't stop. The sound of the forge echoed in his mind. Clang, clang, hiss, every swing guided by instinct. Then came the twist no one expected. A figure stepped into the courtyard. Lord Edrin himself. Not in armor, but in fine robes, flanked by his personal guard. He didn't look angry. He looked amused. Well, Edrin said, voice calm. The blacksmith leads a revolution. Oswin stared, breathing hard. You take too much. And you think a few stolen blades and a band of woodsmen can change that? Edrin asked. He raised a hand. His guards moved in closer. But then, something strange happened. From the shadows of the alley behind the inn, more villagers appeared. Old men with pitchforks. Young women with tools turned to weapons. Oswin looked around, heart racing. The village had come. Still, Edrin didn't flinch. Then let's make a bargain, he said slowly. You give up now, return what you've taken, and I won't burn the village to the ground tomorrow. Oswin stepped forward, blade at his side, voice steady. You'll do nothing, because if you raise a single torch, you'll be the one who burns. You've ruled by fear, but fear only works when we're alone. Edrin's smile faltered. It was the first crack in his calm. But before anything more could be said, A horn sounded from the east road, a long, low blast. Everyone froze. Edric turned to Oswin. "That's not ours." From the mist came riders, dozens of them, armored but bearing no banner. No one in the courtyard recognized them, not even Idrin. As they came to a halt, one rider dismounted and lifted his helmet. His face was weathered, with a long scar across his cheek. "I am Sir Elric of the King's Third Company," he said, loudly enough for all to hear. "We ride on orders of the crown." Idrin stepped forward, confused. "This is my land. What business do you have here?" Elric looked past him to the people gathered, to the forge smoke still rising in the distance. Reports of unlawful taxation, harsh treatment of villagers, forged documents sent to the royal court. Idrin's face went pale. Oswin's eyes widened. Someone had sent word to the king. But who? Elric's eyes landed on Oswin. "Are you the smith?" "Yes," Oswin said, uncertain. Elric gave a nod. "Then it's time we talk." And just like that, the fight paused, but the war for justice had only begun. In the cool light of dawn that followed the tense standoff, the village found itself caught in a fragile pause between rebellion and repression. Sir Elric's arrival had shifted the balance. The assembled crowd, rebels, common villagers, and even a few hesitating guards, watched as Lord Idrin's confident facade crumbled under the unexpected presence of the king's messenger. Slowly, as if guided by fate and the hard-won truth that justice could not be silenced, Idrin lowered his hand. His eyes, once cold and calculating, now searched the faces of his own guards and the villagers, as though he had suddenly seen the severity of his own decisions. In that moment, the weight of years of cruelty and exploitation bore down on him, and he realized that ruling through fear had only led to division and anger. The king's decree, delivered sternly by Sir Elric, made it clear the crown would no longer tolerate unlawful taxation, forced labor, or the secret hoarding of wealth at the expense of the people. The message was simple and unyielding, a call for accountability and fairness that resonated deeply with everyone present. Oswin, the blacksmith who had become the reluctant leader of the uprising, stepped forward with a calm determination that belied the storm of emotions churning inside him. Holding his well-worn hammer in one hand and the mysterious shard of metal, now safely hidden away, in the other, he addressed the crowd in a voice that rang clear across the square. "We have labored in silence and been forced to live in fear for far too long," he said. "Today, we stand not as subjects, but as a community united by hard work and the strength of our craft. My forge has always been a place of creation and survival. Today, it becomes a symbol of our reclaimed dignity." His words mingled with the soft glow of the rising sun and the lingering smoke from the forge, igniting a spark of hope among the villagers who had long suffered under oppressive rule. In that moment, many saw not just a blacksmith, but a guardian of their collective future, someone who had harnessed the fierce power of iron and fire to fight for justice. Sir Elric, with the weight of the king's justice behind him, led a small detachment of loyal soldiers into the village, ensuring that what had begun as a desperate uprising did not spiral into indiscriminate violence. The king's intervention, it turned out, was not a ploy to crush the rebellion, but to restore order and fairness. As Sir Elric conferred quietly with the beleaguered local magistrate and Lord Idrin, the latter's defiant expression softened into one of reluctant acceptance. The king's officers assured everyone that investigations would be launched into the excesses of the local lords and that the unlawful taxes and measures which had driven the village to desperation would be repealed. The stern yet measured tone of the king's message, delivered under the banner of royal authority, brought a palpable sense of relief, a promise that the lives of the common people, the farmers, the artisans, and yes, even the blacksmith whose blades had cut through more than metal, were valued. In a flash, old scores seemed to settle, and the prospects for a fair future glimmered like the polished surface of a newly forged sword. Later that day, as the village slowly began to stir with cautious optimism, Oswin returned to his forge. The familiar ring of hammer against anvil, the steady glow of the fire, and the soothing scent of hot metal mingled with the sweetness of hope. Neighbors, who had once kept their distance in fear, now gathered around to speak in low, earnest tones about rebuilding what had been lost. Families embraced, and even the children, whose playful laughter had been stifled by anxiety, returned to the streets. Oswin, weary but resolute, looked at the tools and weapons scattered across his bench, not as instruments of war or subjugation, but as symbols of the resilience of human spirit and the enduring power of honest labor. Every chisel, every horseshoe, every newly forged blade spoke of survival, of a life built not on exploitation, but on unity and mutual respect. The mysterious shard of otherworldly metal, once a harbinger of chaos and an emblem of hidden forces, was now locked away, a reminder that sometimes even the most perplexing mysteries must remain unsolved, leaving behind lessons that guide future generations. As dusk fell and the village gathered in a modest celebration, a blend of relief and remembrance, the air was filled with quiet determination and a newfound sense of self-worth. The scent of roasted meat and fresh bread mingled with the metallic tang of the forge, symbolizing both the pastoral simplicity and the enduring industrial heart of their lives. Elderly villagers recounted tales of older times, when loyalty and honor were as common as the grains that grew in their fields, while youngsters listened with wide eyes to stories of how a blacksmith's courage had sparked a revolution. Oswin sat quietly in the background, watching not as a hero, but as a man who had discovered that his gift for shaping iron was also his gift for shaping destinies. His hands, once calloused only by labor, now carried the gentle marks of compassion and resolve. His face, tired, scarred, yet determined, shone with the light of a truth that could not be hidden any longer. That even in the harshest times, when the metal of life is hammered and reshaped by forces beyond our control, there remains a strength in community and the power of standing up for what is right. Yet even as peace began to settle like a soft blanket over the village, a final unexpected twist whispered on the wind, a secret revelation that would leave a lasting impression. From the half-open doorway of the now-quiet keep, a lone figure emerged. It was Lord Edrin, but not as he had been before. His expression was not of a proud ruler or a defeated tyrant, but of a man weighed down by regret and the realization that even power corrupts when left unchecked. In his hand, he held an old, tarnished medallion that bore the insignia of the very same secret order that had once operated in the shadows, the Hollow Suns. It turned out that the order was not entirely vanquished, but had been quietly influencing events, even within the highest echelons of nobility. Lord Edrin's soft-spoken confession to Sir Elric, and later to a gathering of trusted villagers, revealed that he had unwittingly played a part in the corruption that plagued the kingdom for years. The medallion was a symbol of an ancient pact between the people and forces beyond the mortal realm, a pact meant to ensure balance. Its reappearance signified that, although the immediate rebellion had found resolution, the deeper struggle between power and justice was far from over. But for that day, the village could breathe easy, knowing that the long-hidden truth was finally coming to light, prompting further reforms and a reassessment of power across the realm. In the quiet that followed, as stars emerged in the cool night sky and the echoes of earlier strife softened into memories, the villagers and their newfound leaders gathered together. They talked long into the night about lessons learned, about the importance of unity, and the simple truth that every hammer strike and every spark of the forge carried the potential to kindle hope. Oswin, now recognized not only as a blacksmith but as a guardian of his community's future, felt a deep sense of gratitude mixed with resolve. The fires of the forge had illuminated more than steel that day. They had shown that even the most brutal lives can give way to renewal. And as he looked out over the quiet streets, where laughter slowly replaced fear, he knew that while the battle had been hard-fought, the true victory lay in the resilience of the human heart. In that moment, with every remaining ember glowing softly like a beacon in the night, Oswin understood that his legacy, and that of his people, would be defined not by the weapons they forged, but by the lives they rebuilt together.